They smiled with you, didn't they? Shared your table, echoed your laughter, and pretended to hold your trust like it was sacred. But behind closed doors, when the lights dimmed and your back was turned, they became someone else. They thought you'd never know, that their secrets were safe in silence, hidden beneath shadows and half-truths. But what they forgot is that your eyes weren't the only ones watching. God saw it all. Every whispered betrayal, every carefully aimed deception, every mask they wore when you weren't looking. And the justice of heaven, it doesn't sleep. It remembers. The room you never entered was still watched. They plotted in places you were never invited. They exchanged glances across rooms where your name was spoken like a riddle, like a weightless thing that didn't matter. Conversations happened behind closed doors, with doors you never knocked on, in corners where your goodness was rewritten into weakness. And they thought you'd never know. They thought the absence of your presence meant the absence of justice. But what they forgot, what they never accounted for, is that you weren't the only one meant to see. You weren't supposed to walk into that room, because God was already standing there. There's a kind of arrogance in betrayal done in secret, a belief that if no one's watching, it doesn't count, that if the target isn't there, the harm disappears into the walls. But heaven doesn't need witnesses. Heaven is the witness. God saw every word spoken with a crooked tongue, every lie wrapped in charm, every moment where your name was mishandled like something disposable. And you, perhaps you walked away too early, or maybe you never suspected at all. Maybe you trusted them fully, without hesitation, without suspicion. And why wouldn't you? You gave them the best of you. But while they were crafting strategies, weaving stories that would serve their image and feed their ego, God was simply watching. Quiet, unmoving, but recording every moment with precision. They misunderstood your absence as blindness. They thought your silence meant you were naive, but they never understood that some people are protected by grace. You didn't step into that room, not because you weren't capable, but because heaven kept you out of it, for a reason. You see, not all rooms are meant for your presence. Some are meant only for exposure. And when the time is right, everything said in that space will surface. It always does. Because truth is like breath. It cannot be held forever. It rises. They sat around tables where you were the topic but not the guest. They wore concern like a costume, sympathy like a prop, pretending to wish you well while secretly hoping for your fall. And the bitterness behind their words, it was never about you. It was about their own reflection, because you reminded them of something they couldn't imitate. Your peace, your light, your quiet strength. It made their chaos feel louder. So they tried to undo you when you weren't looking. But even as they whispered, even as they plotted, they were being watched. Not by the world, not by others, but by the one who sees beyond appearances. There's no corner dark enough, no distance far enough to escape divine sight. You may not have seen what they did. You may not have heard what they said. But your absence did not mean silence in heaven. The room you never entered was never empty. Silence is not blindness. They mistook your silence for blindness, as if your quiet nature meant you didn't notice the shifts in tone, the sudden absence of warmth, the way conversations stopped when you entered the room. They thought that because you didn't confront them, you didn't understand. But your silence wasn't ignorance. It was restraint. It was wisdom wearing the robe of stillness, because deep down you saw, you felt. You observed the inconsistencies, the passive withdrawal, the way loyalty turned into performance. And though you said nothing, your soul knew. The spirit within you recorded what the eyes chose not to reveal. There's a rare kind of power in holding back when you know the truth. When you could expose, but you choose not to. Not because you're afraid, but because you trust that what is done in dishonor will never bear lasting fruit. You didn't speak because you were too noble to wrestle in the mud. You chose the high road, not out of weakness but out of conviction. And still, they saw your patience and called it foolishness. They labeled your grace as gullibility. What they didn't understand was that your silence was not a lack of awareness. It was your refusal to be pulled into their games. You noticed the change in how they spoke to you, the hesitation in their voices, the slight curve of insincerity behind their smiles. You felt it when their support turned into cold politeness, when their absence began to echo louder than their presence. But you waited. Not because you didn't have words, but because you knew timing matters. Because when God speaks, it is never rushed. And you've learned to mirror that, watching. The truth is, some betrayals don't need to be confronted. They expose themselves. Lies collapse under their own weight. So you stayed silent, and they mistook it for approval. But heaven knew better. You were not silent because you didn't know. You were silent because you did. And you didn't need to avenge yourself. You didn't need to shout the truth from rooftops or gather allies to prove your worth. You knew that light reveals, always. So you stood still, and you let your integrity do the talking. Their actions were loud, but your silence was louder, because dignity doesn't need a defense. It simply stands. And even when no one else saw what was really happening, even when no one clapped for your quiet endurance, God did. God saw the restraint in your clenched hands. He saw the tears you refused to let fall in front of them. He saw how you chose peace over revenge, how you swallowed pain so you wouldn't pass it on. And in that silence, something holy happened. Something eternal was being built, not just a defense, but a record. Not just a moment, but a monument. You walked through seasons where your voice was buried, but your spirit stayed awake. You endured conversations that drained you, interactions that insulted your intelligence, and yet you remained composed, because you understood that silence isn't weakness, it's strategy when you're aligned with heaven. The weight of secret hands. They clapped when you succeeded, they smiled when you rose, they even spoke well of you when others watched. But hidden beneath the applause were hands that moved differently in private. Secret hands. Hands that passed along twisted stories, shifted blame, planted doubt. They wore the robe of friendship in the open, but in the quiet they were architects of harm. And they thought those hands were clean because they acted in silence. But silence is not purity, and secrecy is not innocence. Every act carries weight, even when it's done in the dark. What they didn't realize was that the same God who blesses in public also watches in private. The hands they used to build false versions of you now carry the burden of their own deception. They feel it. They carry it in restless sleep, in strained relationships, in the eyes of people who no longer fully trust them, but can't explain why. Because energy follows intention, and the energy behind those secret acts, manipulation, jealousy, sabotage, does not go unnoticed by heaven. There's a heaviness that comes from doing wrong in the name of self-protection. They convinced themselves they were justified, that they were just being honest or sharing their truth. But truth is never afraid of the full picture, and if the story needs to be edited in secret, then it was never the truth to begin with. They acted like you were the threat, all while hiding the evidence of their own insecurity, and instead of confronting their own reflection, they tried to dim your light, hoping that your silence would make their actions disappear. But heaven doesn't operate on human timelines. The things they buried don't stay buried. The hands they thought were unseen are now weighed down, not by you, but by the very consequences they denied. You never lifted a finger against them, and still their conscience became heavy. That's the nature of divine justice. It doesn't require your participation. It moves quietly, patiently, until the balance corrects itself. You don't need to name names. You don't need to retaliate. Their hands, once so quick to harm, now tremble with the fear of being found out. Not by you, but by the very truth they tried to distort. The most dangerous lies are the ones told with charm. The most damaging betrayals are those wrapped in kindness. They shook your hand while questioning your worth. They hugged you while wondering how to replace you. And yet the same hands that tried to erase you are now burdened by what they've done. Because hands can pretend, but the soul never lies. Their spirit carries the weight of their actions, and no matter how well they hide it from others, they cannot hide it from themselves. The quiet nights are no longer quiet. The mirror speaks now. The things they once said so easily are now trapped in the back of their throat. And all because they thought the weight of harm could be avoided if no one saw them do it. But God saw. God always sees. And now the weight remains. You were protected by delay. You wondered why things didn't work out, why certain doors never opened, why certain people left without warning, why the opportunity you prayed for slipped right through your fingers. At the time, it felt like rejection, like abandonment, like maybe you weren't enough. But what you didn't see then, and maybe you're only starting to see now, is that the delay wasn't punishment. It was protection. God didn't deny you. He shielded you, because what you thought was a blessing was actually a battlefield in disguise. You were praying for connection, but behind those smiles were sharp edges. You were asking for closeness, but the people you wanted to be near were hiding motives you couldn't see. And while you were preparing your heart to love, they were sharpening theirs to use. That's why the doors didn't open. That's why the plans fell apart. Because God, in His mercy, interrupted what you thought was perfect timing, not to hurt you, but to preserve you from harm that hadn't yet arrived. Delay feels like silence. It feels like God is ignoring you. But heaven's silence isn't absence, it's strategy. You were being slowed down for a reason, not because you lacked the strength, but because your spirit was too precious to be handed over to the wrong situation. You didn't see the hidden agendas, the quiet envy, the subtle traps, but God did. He saw what waited behind the approval you were chasing. He saw the heartbreak hidden inside the opportunity you thought you lost. And because He loved you, He let you feel the sting of delay, so you wouldn't feel the devastation of destruction. There are moments in life where the closed door is not a rejection, it's divine interference. You prayed for clarity, and what you got was confusion. But that confusion pushed you away from people who couldn't be trusted. That confusion made you question things you were never meant to depend on. And even in the pain, something inside you was being trained to listen more deeply, not to voices around you, but to the voice within. That's where God speaks. That's where the truth lives. You wanted speed. God wanted security. You were ready to leap. He was ready to shield. And so the delay came, not as an enemy but as a guardian. It came to give you time, to see more, to grow deeper, to detach from what looked good but wasn't grounded. The delay was the wall that stood between you and disaster disguised as destiny. You may have cried in the waiting, but now you see what almost got to you, and suddenly the silence makes sense. Suddenly the pause feels holy. Looking back, you can trace the line. You can see the moments that didn't make sense, until now. The people who left right before the truth came out. The offer that disappeared before the storm behind it revealed itself. These weren't coincidences. They were calculated rescues, dressed in disappointment. The quiet verdict. You thought you needed to explain yourself. You thought if you just told your side of the story, people would understand, see the truth, feel the injustice, defend your name. But the more you tried to speak, the more you were met with silence, or worse, disbelief. And so you stopped. Not because you gave up, but because you realized some truths don't need to be shouted. Some truths carry their own voice. Time listens. Time reveals. And while you waited, something deeper was happening. A verdict was forming. Not in courtrooms, not in public debates, but in silence. A quiet verdict. One written not by opinion, but by divine observation. God saw it all. Every moment you bit your tongue. Every moment you let them think they won. Every moment you walked away from a fight you could have finished with one sentence of truth. But you chose peace. You chose stillness. You chose the long road. The one that doesn't demand revenge, but trusts justice to unfold in its own time. And it is. Slowly, quietly, truth is emerging. Their stories no longer align. Their energy has shifted. The confidence they once wore when they told their version of events is starting to crack. And, not because you spoke, but because lies rot from the inside out. People are starting to notice. The same ones who once doubted you now watch in silence. They feel something is off. They can't explain it yet, but they sense it. That's the thing about false narratives. They need constant maintenance. They need new lies to hold up the old ones. But the truth? It stands on its own. It doesn't beg for belief. It simply waits. And now, the wait is almost over. You didn't retaliate. You didn't smear their name. You didn't run around trying to control the narrative. And that confused them. They expected you to react. They counted on your anger so they could justify their actions. But instead, you gave them nothing. And in that nothing, they began to unravel. Because truth thrives in silence, and lies suffocate in it. You were never supposed to fight this battle with noise. Your weapons were patience, endurance, and consistency. Every day you chose to rise with grace. You were writing a chapter in the real story. And now, that story is starting to echo. People are remembering who you were, how you acted, what you didn't say. They're starting to notice the contrast, the peace in your eyes versus the defensiveness in theirs, the integrity of your silence versus the desperation of their justifications. This is how justice comes, not always with a bang, but with a whisper, a shift, a quiet awareness that the one who stayed silent was never guilty, just guarded, that the one who walked away didn't run, but chose a higher road. And slowly, without announcement, the truth settles. the quiet verdict arrives. No fanfare, no applause. Just peace where there used to be pain, and clarity where there used to be confusion.